This thing that we've decided to do as founders and as investors is probably one of the hardest things that a human being can possibly do. It takes grit, it takes stamina, it takes a tremendous amount of fortitude. And the thing that always brings me back to center when I'm a little bit wonky, and that happens, is the community that I have around me. So I'm really happy to be here and be extending that community. Dee thought it would be a good idea for me to give you like just a little bit of perspective on some tactics, some hardcore tactics that have worked for me in my life as a founder, and particularly somebody who's raised a lot of money. Does that sound like something that would be useful? I want you to feel like you walked away and got something out of it. And I'll be pretty brief. But before we get into that, I feel like it's just important for you to know where I'm coming from. So I'm going to tell you about who I am. So I was born and raised in San Francisco, California. My grandparents moved to the Bay Area during this time called the Great Migration. This is when Southern blacks were moving to northern cities to take advantage of new economic opportunities. This was the time of segregation. My grandfather was the first black dentist on the faculty of University of California at San Francisco. So he was essentially the only black dentist in San Francisco. As you could imagine, this made him a very popular guy. Everybody knew my grandpa, and I actually look a lot like him. And still, when I go into the Fillmore, people will sometimes say, "Are you Dr. Collins' student?" You know, I said, "Yep, that's my grandpa." So for me, I grew up in these households, my grandparents' household, my parents' household, where there was a lot of activity, and food was really the way that everybody from all these walks of life got together. I remember going to friends' houses and thinking it was so odd that they would set 4 places and sit down at 6:30. I just never understood that. At my house, it was come one, come all. There's always something on the stove, and you're always welcome. So as a little girl, I grew up with this understanding that the feeling of being safe and loved and connected all came from this idea of sharing food together. I always knew that I wanted to be in food. But when I told my family that, and I think part of the story of coming from the families that we do is that there's this orientation around achievement. You know, what's the best that you can do? And when I said, I want to be in restaurants, my grandpa, I think he actually cried. So I did the opposite. I did what my grandpa wanted. I went off to Harvard to study biomedical engineering because I thought that was literally the most impressive thing I could possibly do. But even at 18 years old, I really knew I wasn't living in my authentic truth. I was like a fish out of water. It just didn't fit. It was just like the discomfort of wearing something that doesn't belong to you. And so I kind of meandered my way to New York City after graduation and lived here. And that's when I started to really get real with myself. And I knew that if I could begin to live in my authentic truth from a professional perspective, that I'd probably be a lot more successful. So as we think about the reason why we're doing what we're doing, the reason why it's important for us to change the way that people experience the continent of Africa, the way that people relate to their psychological health, their wellness, it's all coming from this really deep place inside us. And so I'm going to get to some tactical insights, but that's going to kind of bridge us over. So I graduated from business school in 2009, moved to New York City, built a pretty scrappy, awesome food company called Mexique, which I encourage you guys to try. It's a mix of Mexican and barbecue. And so I talk to you as a person who's had the perspective of bootstrapping that business off of my credit card. And I'm not talking about an Amex Black or an Amex Platinum. I'm talking about like 3 MasterCards with like a $10,000 limit and cobbling them together. There were days in that business where I had to get back on, we had a food truck at the time, I had to get back on the truck and go out and sell tacos in Williamsburg to make enough cash to run to TD Bank, to put it in the bank to make payroll. Like, I really know what it's like to be cash constrained. And it's part of the reason why this movement is so important to me. You know, Mexique is a fantastic business. We almost didn't make it. There were so many times when we just almost ran out of gas because we didn't have enough cash and we didn't have access to capital. Now I've had this really unique experience of co-founding Zume and reaching a unicorn valuation and having raised hundreds of millions of dollars. So I really understand the perspective. I will tell you this. I am no less proud of Mexique than I am of Zume. I fundamentally do not value myself based on the valuation of my company. And that's why this like first black female unicorn thing, I haven't talked about it. Because for me, on an individual basis, it means absolutely nothing. The reason why I talk about it in this room with you is because I think it's so important for us to uplift each other, and I have cracked that ceiling. I've cracked it because I have no interest in being the only. I cracked it so that we can all come flooding through that crack together. And beyond that, I'm very confident. I'm looking at Eugene. I'm very confident that the next black female unicorn is sitting right here. And although she has a little cold, it's her. So I want to talk about tactics, and I'm not going to take too much time. I mean, it's hard to even want to talk about tactics to a room like this because there's so much that you already know. I mean, you already know the easy things like know your numbers, be very fluent in the language of investors, know about CAC to LTV ratios, know about your customer journey, your product pipe. You guys know all of that. But there are 3 things that were a little bit unexpected that I learned during this last 3 years of raising money in Silicon Valley. The first tactical piece of advice that I would give you is actually to be less tactical in the way that you describe your companies. This was really surprising to me. I'm somebody who is very literal in many ways. When I go to tell you what I'm doing, I'm going to tell you exactly what I'm doing. Here are all the steps. Here are all the things I know. Here are all the things I don't know. And it turns out that within the context of raising venture money, for me, that was really not the best strategy. What worked for me ultimately was leading with the vision. I want to save the planet. I want to feed the world and save the planet. A vision that big. That got people's attention more so than saying, I want to launch a new logistical platform for delivering food to customers, right? So that's one thing. The second thing I would say is it's unlikely that you're going to have some new elegance and confidence in the boardroom that you haven't already cultivated in your personal life. And so sometimes as a founder, I felt like investors were like these magical people that lived on Sand Hill Road who had these interesting habits, and they all wore hooded sweatshirts, zipped exactly 3/4 of the way up. Never fully, never half, just right. And I was simultaneously enchanted and dismayed. And the problem was I didn't have any friends that were investors. I hadn't really broadened my personal network so that I had that level of comfort and fluency that comes from human contact. So if you haven't met Megan, I encourage you to meet her. If you haven't spent time with Avia, you should definitely do that. You want to do this thing that we call soft circling. So before you go out to raise, properly raise, you want to begin to socialize your presence in the market. You want to cultivate relationships with investors and by the way, when I say on a non-evaluative basis, I know that everything is evaluative ultimately. But what I'm saying is you want to go and have lunch with Megan to get to know her and to talk to her even before you're ready to start raising, because there's a psychology that happens when you actually feel comfort, when you feel that level of confidence, so that when you go in to ask for $100 million, you feel really comfortable with the person that you're sitting in front of. And then the final thing, this is super tactical, but it's something that I did not know. This journey of being a founder is taxing in many ways. It can be really taxing financially. When I was at Mexico, I didn't pay myself for 2.5 years. That was really hard. And that was 2.5 years after graduating from business school, where I had also not been making any money for 2 years. And I left that business literally because I just ran out of gas. I couldn't afford to keep running the business, and I had to leave it to my partners, which thankfully I had great partners. But that's really a pity. What I didn't know is that as you raise money in subsequent rounds, it's completely appropriate, and it is really the practice to take money off of the table. So whether it's in your A or your B, you should negotiate, this is my perspective again, some provision where you sell back a portion of your equity to take some cash and give yourself a little cushion and a little runway so that you can get to your C and your D and your exit. this is not something that people are going to tell you. It's unlikely that your investors are going to say, hey, wouldn't you like to take a little money off in this round? But it is absolutely the practice that happens frequently in Silicon Valley, and something that I think is really important for founders to advocate for themselves, because it gives you the kind of personal liquidity that gives you comfort and security as you go to build your businesses. So those are my 3 tactical pieces of advice. I hope that's been helpful.